The day I brought General John back was the day of the Mid-Autumn Festival banquet in the palace.
King Edward, I request General John.
No, I cannot yield him to you.
The next day, I ordered someone to bring back the woman he had grown up with. I threw her in front of him.
Do you like her?
His eyes turned red.
No.
The consequences of not telling the truth are severe.
I grabbed the woman lying on the ground and caressed her face.
Such a delicate beauty, I'm afraid she can't withstand the punishments of the palace.
The woman closed her eyes in despair, trembling slightly under my hand. General John became visibly anxious.
Princess Isabella, what do you want to do?
I want you to tell the truth. Do you love her?
He struggled for a while.
Yes.
I don't care about your past. But from now on, you belong to the princess's residence.
General John stiffened but lowered his eyes without saying anything.
General, I'm sorry, you came too late. You can only be the 28th consort in my residence. If you had come earlier, maybe I would have only wanted you and no one else.
General John remained silent, but his eyes were filled with hatred as he stared at me. I felt a sudden pang of sadness and turned my head away instinctively. Don't look at me with those eyes. William never looked at me like that. I brought General John back because his face bore a striking resemblance to William's. Especially those eyes. The first time I saw William was when I was 12 years old. He came to the palace with his father for a banquet. At that time, I was punishing a young maid, holding a whip and beating her until she was covered in wounds. William looked at me steadily and stopped me.
Why are you beating her?
I put down the whip in surprise and looked at him. He frowned at me, his young face cold and stern, his bright eyes like stars.
Who are you, to not bow when you see the princess?
Your Highness, why are you making things difficult for this maid?
For no reason, because I'm unhappy.
A maid may have a low status, but she is also a human being, born of parents with flesh and blood.
Looking at his righteous face, I inexplicably felt better and nodded.
Fine, I won't beat her today.
My mother, Queen Elizabeth, told me that as a noble princess, I could order the execution of maids and eunuchs at will if I was unhappy. The lives of servants were as worthless as grass. But William said they were people with flesh and blood, just like me. When I was 16, I married William. That same year, his father was imprisoned for corruption. I said I could find a way to get his father out. But he frowned and refused me.
Ava, you don't have to do that. I've investigated, and my father is not innocent. He did break the law, and we cannot interfere.
In the moonlight, he looked like a painting in his white clothes, cold and lonely like an immortal. I thought, how could there be such a good person in the world? He taught me to be kind to others but refused to bend the law for personal gain. A year after our marriage, my father suddenly fell ill. My father's illness came on fiercely, and it seemed unlikely he would recover. Prince Alexander was violent by nature, often abducting women, even married ones, causing many to take desperate measures. After discussing with William, we decided that only King Edward could take on the responsibility, as the other princes were still young. Although William held no official position, he had a deep understanding of court affairs. Somehow, Prince Alexander learned of William's strategic prowess and repeatedly invited him to conspire with him. William refused Prince Alexander multiple times, and I had a bad feeling. But I was too young then, thinking that as William was my husband, Prince Alexander wouldn't dare harm him. Until the situation escalated, I realized that with Prince Alexander's temperament, harming William was nothing. William was surrounded, and I desperately pleaded with the minister sent by Prince Alexander.
Please, spare him.
The minister remained unmoved, his face indifferent. William had practiced martial arts since childhood and was highly skilled. I held on to a glimmer of hope, thinking he might escape. But Prince Alexander threatened him with the lives of over 100 people in the residence.
If you escape, these people will not survive.
At that moment, I felt utterly hopeless. I knew he wouldn't escape. I sat on the ground in despair, watching William's body being pierced, his white clothes stained with blood. Until the last moment, his expression remained indifferent, as if he didn't feel any pain. He looked at me gently.
Ava, I'm sorry.
Until his passing, he didn't know I was carrying his child. I had planned to surprise him on his birthday. But he would never hear it. A crazy thought arose in my mind. I wanted everyone to accompany him in passing. I ordered the execution of everyone in the residence. If it weren't for them, if it weren't for saving them, William wouldn't have died. So they deserved to die. The blood of over 100 people nearly stained the entire residence red, a sea of crimson. Looking at the blood, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. Suddenly, I fainted. When I woke up, the doctor told me I had lost my child. My child had gone with William. Later, I used every means to bring down Prince Alexander and helped my brother ascend the throne. After King Edward took the throne, I collected anyone who resembled William into the princess's residence as my consorts. I needed them to accompany me, otherwise, I couldn't bear the pain. General John was the one who resembled William the most.
John, don't.
Before I could speak, General John frowned and glared at her, scolding.
Lily, don't speak!
Nanny Martha, slap her.
A small punishment to teach her what to say and what not to say. Nanny Martha, an experienced palace servant, followed the order without hesitation, slapping Lily's face hard on both sides.
That's enough.
I still had use for her and couldn't let her suffer easily. I stepped forward and saw her pitiful face, with red handprints on both cheeks, slightly swollen. Such a pitiful face. I didn't need to look to know General John's expression. He felt sorry for her and hated me. Enough, I was tired. I waved my hand and had them taken away. Charles came to see me with the carp soup he had made. His culinary skills were excellent, especially his soups. Carp soup, made with wild carp and herbs like white atractylodes, poria, and peony, was white in color and fresh in taste. I always liked it and knew it was labor-intensive to make.
Thank you for your hard work.
As long as the princess likes it.
As I sipped the soup, he casually said,
I heard the princess brought back General John.
Why, is that a problem?
Sensing my displeasure, he quickly said,
The princess misunderstood. I didn't mean that. I just thought, General John has been fighting for years and might not be willing to stay in the princess's residence.
You don't need to worry about that. I have my ways. No matter how strong-willed John is, I can break his pride.
He doesn't appreciate you. The princess should find someone more sensible. Why waste your efforts on him?
I narrowed my eyes, becoming wary. After scrutinizing him for a moment, Charles's expression remained unchanged. Seeing my displeasure, Charles gently patted my back to comfort me.
Princess, I spoke out of turn. The princess can do as she pleases.
I lazily slid down, lying on his chest, and closed my eyes.
I'm tired. Give me a shoulder massage.
Charles was always the most obedient, which was why he had stayed by my side for so long. I intended to take a nap, but the inconsiderate General John came to disturb me. Princess, General John requests an audience. I opened my eyes, somewhat annoyed. Why choose this moment to disturb me? I squinted slightly and called him in. Charles held me, and I didn't bother to get up.
General John, what is it?
General John looked weary, but his handsome features were still evident, stirring something within me. He looked so much like him. He stood straight. At 17, General John had repelled the enemy and achieved great merit, earning King Edward's permission to never kneel before anyone. After a long silence, he still said nothing. I prompted again.
General John, I'm asking you.
Charles also said.
General, what is it? Speak quickly and don't waste everyone's time.
General John finally spoke with difficulty.
I want to ask the princess to release Lily.
I raised an eyebrow, saying nothing. He would regret saying that soon enough. He didn't understand that the more he wanted to protect that woman, the more I wanted to eliminate her. General John couldn't read my expression and continued.
Lily is just a weak woman. If the princess keeps her in the dungeon, she might not survive.
Seeing that I was unmoved, he wanted to plead further, but Charles stopped him.
General, once the princess has made a decision, no one can change it. Stop talking.
General John's face darkened, as if he saw no hope. I pushed Charles away, walked up to General John, and said calmly.
John, you think too highly of me.
I reached out to lift his chin, but he instinctively avoided it.
Tisk. Still not learning. He promised to obey me, but his body always instinctively rejected me.
John, I will make you completely submit to me.
Let's go.
Where to?
I smirked.
Accompany me to the palace. I had a good idea.
Farewell, princess.
John followed, but I was dissatisfied.
Why are you walking so far away? Come walk beside me.
Walking beside the princess was an honor.
No, princess, please walk ahead. I dare not overstep.
Very well, John was indeed a tough nut to crack. This small matter could be left to him, but soon he would have no choice but to comply. My residence was not far from the palace, and we arrived in less than half an hour. I looked at the sky. At this hour, King Edward should be in the Purple Hall. As soon as I entered, King Edward greeted me happily.
Come, try the pastries Lady Margaret made.
I waved my hand.
Brother, I came today to ask for a favor.
King Edward became interested.
Oh? Which young man have you set your sights on this time?
He made it sound like I was always seizing men. In fact, most men were willing to enter the princess's residence to enjoy wealth and honor, but John was an exception. Only then did King Edward notice General John at the door.
Ah, isn't that General John? Why are you standing at the door? Come in.
Yes.
Even as he walked in, he kept a distance of 8 feet from me, as if being close to me was unbearable. Ha, soon, you will have no choice but to be close to me. I smiled and said loudly.
Please, brother, issue a decree for marriage.
King Edward almost spat out his tea in disbelief.
You, say that again?
In the past, King Edward often mentioned marriage, but I always refused. Over time, he gave up. He never expected that at 22, I would suddenly bring up marriage. I smiled and repeated.
Please, brother, issue a decree for marriage.
King Edward finally calmed down and said.
This is good news. But who do you want to marry?
I was staring at John, seeing him extremely tense, his hands clenched into fists, his expression serious.
Naturally, I want to marry General John.
Forcing John into the princess's residence was already a betrayal by King Edward. Now, with my request, King Edward would be even more embarrassed. Earlier, he had been calm and composed, but now he was visibly uneasy. General John had been leading troops since he was 14, serving the country for many years, yet he ended up like this. It was unreasonable. But that was not my concern. King Edward, being who he was, quickly regained his composure. He coughed and hypocritically asked,
General John, do you agree to this marriage?
There was no need to ask, John's entire being screamed refusal. But I knew he wouldn't dare utter a word of dissent. I glanced at him nonchalantly, seeing the despair in his eyes. Marrying someone you don't love must be painful. Seeing that he couldn't bring himself to agree, I spoke for him.
Of course, he agrees. Brother, just issue the decree.
Seeing my decisiveness, King Edward waved his hand, and a decree was issued for my marriage to General John. John's eyes were dark, devoid of light. The princess's wedding was an unparalleled spectacle. The entire nation celebrated, and a general amnesty was declared. I thought this might be the only good deed I would do in my life. Oh, and this good deed was at the expense of General John. 10 of the country's finest tailors made 10 exquisite wedding gowns for me. I touched each one, admiring the intricate gold and silver threads. One of them had a slight flaw.
Who made this one?
A woman, thinking she was about to be rewarded, replied joyfully.
Princess, I made this one.
I picked up the flawed gown and threw it on the ground.
Take her away and execute her.
The woman struggled and begged for mercy, but I remained indifferent, even a bit annoyed. John, who had been silent for a long time, suddenly grabbed my sleeve.
Let her go. She didn't commit a serious crime.
My red lips curved into a smile.
Making me unhappy is an unforgivable mistake. However, since General John has pleaded for her, she will be spared.
John seemed to want to plead further, but I didn't want to hear his nonsense.
Choose a wedding gown for me.
He reluctantly turned his attention to the gowns he had no interest in and finally said,
I don't understand these things. It's better if you choose, princess.
His expression remained indifferent throughout, as if he had no interest in anything related to me.
John, have I been too kind to you?
It was time to give him a harsh lesson.
Do you miss your Lily? Come, I'll take you to see her.
John's eyes showed a hint of panic, as if he sensed my ill intentions. He guessed correctly. I walked step by step into the damp, dark dungeon, lowering myself to enter it for the first time.
General John, be mindful of your words and actions. Remember, I am your fiancée. If you say anything inappropriate, it won't end well.
For the first time, John laughed in front of me, though it was a mocking laugh, which surprised me a little.
Princess, your words are truly shocking. If you're not afraid of being talked about, why should I be?
Indeed, although I wanted to break his rebellious spirit, I had to admit that I liked his character. He had a backbone, just like my William. When he saw his Lily in the cell, his smile vanished. Lily's white clothes were stained with dirt, and she was so weak that she was unconscious. John looked like a mad beast, his eyes bloodshot, veins bulging on his forehead.
Why did you harm her?
I was certain that at that moment, he wanted to harm me. I ignored his roar, indifferently looking at my crimson nails, thinking how beautiful the color was, just like blood. John finally lost control and grabbed my shoulders.
You lunatic! You monster! What do you want?
As soon as he finished speaking, everything fell silent. No one dared to make a sound because everyone knew I was angry. I covered my mouth with a smile and stared into his eyes.
John, do you know the consequences of angering me?
He fell silent and slowly released his grip. I walked closer to Lily, squatted down to look at her face.
John, you will regret your reckless words.
John stepped forward.
I'm sorry, princess. It's all my fault. You can punish me however you want. Just, please don't harm Lily anymore.
He actually knelt before me with a thud. General John, who had fought on the battlefield for years and never knelt to anyone, knelt before me for a woman today. How laughable. I didn't look at him and said coldly,
Bring the branding iron.
I wanted to personally mark the woman he loved. John desperately shielded Lily.
Punish me instead.
I impatiently said.
Are you all dead? Drag him away.
The guards, though somewhat intimidated by the future prince consort, still obeyed me.
General John, forgive us, and restrain the struggling John.
However, John, being the top martial artist in the empire, easily fought them off with his bare hands.
Princess, please, punish me.
These useless guards couldn't even control one John. I rubbed my temples and said,
General John, I advise you not to struggle. Otherwise, if my hand slips, your Lily's well-being will be at risk.
I emphasized the word well-being heavily. Finally, he realized that both his life and Lily's were in my hands, and there was no room for resistance. He slowly lowered his resisting hands. I held the red-hot branding iron, steady and precise, and pressed it onto Lily's face.
She woke up from the pain, desperately trying to retreat, crying out, John, help me.
Unfortunately, your John cannot help you. The guards held her down firmly as I branded her beautiful face, leaving a scar that would never heal. I admired my work with satisfaction, the burnt flesh and the smell of charred meat filling the air. Lily had fainted again. John closed his eyes, unable to bear the sight. His expression was one of immense pain, as if he too had been physically hurt. I put down the branding iron and said cheerfully,
General John, don't worry. I will use the best medicine to keep her alive. I won't let her die. Because I still needed her to slowly torment.
I left John without a second thought. I wanted him to stay here and have a good look at his Lily's injuries, to understand that this was the consequence of defying me. Charles came to see me with a pot of black chicken soup with red dates. His culinary skills surpassed even the best royal chefs. I slowly drank the soup, and he seemed hesitant to speak. After finishing a bowl of soup, I said,
If you have something to say, just say it.
He smiled gently.
Nothing can be hidden from you, Princess. I wanted to ask if you are really determined to marry General John?
I frowned and addressed the situation firmly.
This is not something you should be concerned about.
Charles smiled apologetically.
I misspoke.
I turned to look at him, my gaze intense. Unable to withstand my gaze, he finally gave in.
Princess, I'll leave now.
On the day of the grand wedding, I wore the most magnificent phoenix coronet and robes. The face in the mirror, with its stunning features, was mesmerizing. For some reason, I suddenly smashed the mirror. With a crash.
Please calm down, Princess.
After a while, I spoke softly.
What are you afraid of? Today is a joyous day, there won't be any misfortunes. Nanny Martha, what time is it?
It's almost time, Princess. Please enter the hall.
John was already waiting there, dressed in red. His long eyelashes half covered his pupils, giving him a cold demeanor.
John, it's a joyous day. Smile, don't always look so grim.
He didn't smile or respond. In the evening, in my room, John's face was ashen. I poured a cup of tea, took a sip, and addressed him.
John, don't look like you've lost your mother.
He frowned and ignored me. I lay on the bed, calling him.
John, come here.
John's expression was very resistant as he slowly moved over and lay down without undressing.
No man sleeps in his clothes on his wedding night.
He kept his eyes tightly shut, not saying a word. He pretended to sleep so unconvincingly, no one sleeps with a frown. Using a seductive tone, I leaned close to his ear.
John, do you think you can sleep without fulfilling your marital duties?
He continued to pretend to sleep, not moving at all. I simply lay beside him and spoke calmly.
Have you forgotten the consequences of defying me, General John?
With that, I ignored him and closed my eyes. Moments later, he suddenly got up and pinned me down. I opened my eyes to see the suppressed fire in his dark eyes. He said nothing, almost violently tearing at my clothes, and I cooperated without moving.
John, kiss me.
He kissed me fiercely, biting with a vengeful force. I retaliated just as fiercely, biting his lip until it bled. That night, neither of us spared the other. The next day, when I woke up, John was no longer in the room. As I finished getting ready, Charles arrived. He came with a food box, and as soon as he entered, he opened it to show me bird's nest porridge with shredded chicken and mushrooms.
This is the best breakfast.
You are thoughtful, this is just what I need.
He laid out a few side dishes as well and encouraged me to eat.
Eat more.
While we were talking, a tactless servant coughed twice. I immediately frowned and called out,
Nanny Grace!
Nanny Grace immediately took the servant away, and she cried out,
Princess, have mercy. Princess, please spare me.
I only found the crying annoying and didn't notice the slight change in Charles's expression. A few days after the wedding, John ran away. He took Lily with him.
How long had he been planning, and who helped him break someone out of the dungeon? I need to find out everyone who helped him and leave no one unpunished.
I immediately ordered a carriage to be prepared and headed to the palace. Since John dared to escape, he must have made thorough preparations. I needed King Edward's help to intercept him. King Edward was shocked to hear that John had escaped and tried to be diplomatic.
Well, sister, John has done great service for the country. Maybe you should let him go.
As he spoke, his voice trailed off, and he even tried to use a fan to shield his face, avoiding eye contact with me.
Do as you see fit. If John is not brought back, I will punish all the servants in the princess's residence.
King Edward finally gave the order, and under the pretext of retrieving lost treasures, John was captured outside the city of Yong'an. Lily trembled in his arms, looking pitiful. I laughed instead of getting angry, finding her appearance utterly detestable.
John, I warned you about the consequences of defying me.
His expression changed to one of desperate resolve, as if he wanted to fight back but was wary of me.
You were once the greatest warrior of the empire. If you had escaped alone, no one could have caught you. But you insisted on bringing this burden.
Lily, who was usually so fragile and defenseless, suddenly smiled.
It's a pity that you, a princess, have no one who truly loves you.
John held her tightly, and they clung to each other as if they would never be separated.
John, step aside.
Then please, princess, kill us both.
I gripped my sword tighter, stepping closer to them, the blade pointed at their chests. Lily, despite her frailty, found the courage not to tremble.
John, have you forgotten something?
He still wore that expression of not wanting to look at me, as if he didn't want to speak to me anymore. I stopped laughing and quietly watched their embracing figures.
Who helped you escape?
Their fearless expressions changed simultaneously. I was pleased to see their reactions, not missing a single detail.
Minister Robert, Minister Henry, they are truly pitiful. They helped you, but they will suffer the consequences.
John's face turned ashen.
What do you want to let them go?
Please, princess, spare them. Both ministers are innocent. If you must punish someone, punish me.
I hated seeing her pure and innocent face.
I will only punish her. Without my permission, you have no right to suffer.
Princess, If I suffer, will you spare John and the two ministers?
I remained silent. She probably thought I had agreed and took a step forward, facing my sword. John instinctively tried to stop her, reaching out but only grasping at the air. He finally lost his reckless courage, realizing he couldn't ignore those innocently involved. In this, he was most like William. He knelt again, making his final silent plea. I mercilessly thrust my sword into her chest. She didn't even have time to make a sound before falling, and John caught her in a panic. Her blood splattered all over me. I had never seen such a sorrowful and pained expression on General John's face, as if he had lost the most important thing in his life, his heart breaking. I closed my eyes. I didn't want to see him show such an expression for another person. John didn't cry. I heard him speak in the gentlest voice.
Lily, sleep now.
He held her tightly, pressing his face against her disfigured one, whispering softly.
Lily, it won't hurt if you sleep. John will stay with you, always.
He cradled her like a child, comforting her, even though she was already gone, unable to see or hear. He kissed her lifeless lips, so tenderly and intimately. The figures of the two before me blurred, turning into William and me. The deceased William lay in my arms, and I kissed his cold lips the same way. I suddenly felt a pang in my heart and said hoarsely,
John, she is already gone.
John suddenly roared in a fit of rage.
She's not! Lily is just asleep. She's not gone, and she never will be.
He seemed deranged, a far cry from his former unyielding self. I calmly responded,
If she's not gone, why hasn't she woken up, despite your loud voice?
He was stunned for a moment, then suddenly began to cry. I had seen him kneel many times, but it was the first time I saw him cry. I just stood quietly in front of him, watching his madness, watching his tears. After returning, I immediately ordered the execution of Minister Robert and Minister Henry. King Edward did not intervene, as releasing prisoners from the dungeon without permission was a grave offense. Feeling down, I sought out Charles to drink with me. Charles gently held me and drank with me. I downed a glass of wine.
Charles, should I have never wanted John in the first place?
Charles was momentarily stunned.
Princess, you never consider such things.
I drank too much and mumbled.
Really?
Then I suddenly realized.
Oh, that's right. I've always been like this.
Charles said nothing more, just silently drank with me, glass after glass. Eventually, I passed out in his arms. In my dream, someone was feeding me some soup. I said I didn't want it. He gently coaxed me, tirelessly saying,
Be good, just take a sip, just one sip.
After I took a sip, he continued to feed me, coaxing me to take another sip. When I woke up, my head didn't hurt at all. I realized it wasn't a dream. Charles had fed me a hangover soup. Passing through the back garden, I saw John practicing his swordsmanship. His movements were sharp and forceful, much like William's. After watching for a while, I clapped and spoke with a smile.
General John, impressive swordsmanship.
Only then did he notice me. He sheathed his sword and surprisingly smiled.
Princess, you flatter me.
I was taken aback, then said,
Your smile is too obvious. You should tone it down.
What?
I thought, what's going on here? Could it be that he's lost his mind from grief? At that moment, Charles spoke from behind me.
Princess, General John fell and hit his head the other day.
I turned to him.
When did you get here?
Then I realized the implication of his words.
You mean, he has lost his memory?
Charles nodded at me. I scrutinized John with suspicion. He showed no signs of abnormality, just looked at me with a curious gaze.
He doesn't remember anything. I told him you are the princess, and he is your husband.
So now, he thinks our relationship is that of a normal couple? John cautiously asked.
Princess, what's wrong?
He had never spoken to me in such a tone before. My heart softened inexplicably, and I forgot what I was going to say.
Never mind, this isn't so bad. Charles, you may leave. I want to talk to him alone.
Yes.
He left, and John and I were alone, both unsure of what to say. John seemed a bit shy. Seeing him like this, I suddenly laughed. He looked so much like William used to when he looked at me. Suddenly, he took my hand. I felt an unprecedented flutter in my heart.
Princess, do you not like me holding your hand?
I quickly shook my head and held his hand back.
No. I was just thinking it might rain.
Looking up, the sky was clear, not a cloud in sight.
Princess, are you teasing me?
I felt a thin layer of calluses in his palm, formed from years of wielding a sword. Using a tone I had never used before, I said gently.
You still remember your swordsmanship. Since we have nothing to do today, why don't you teach me?
If the princess is interested, let's give it a try.
So that evening, John stood behind me, guiding my hand, teaching me each move patiently. He was very patient, neither hurried nor annoyed. William used to teach me martial arts the same way, never tiring of showing me again and again. As night fell, we ate quietly. He picked out the dishes I liked. Seeing him pick a dish I usually didn't eat, I said.
I don't eat that.
Princess, being picky isn't a good habit.
I was delighted. William had said the same thing. I ate the food I disliked, and it wasn't as hard to swallow as usual. After a simple meal, he said we should take a walk to aid digestion, pulling me along to stroll around the princess's residence. The moonlight spread across the ground, bright enough to see the path without lanterns. It was late autumn, and many chrysanthemums were in full bloom, their fragrance faintly filling the air. Walking among the chrysanthemums, I felt a peace I had never known. The wind was a bit chilly. John took off his outer robe and draped it over me, softly saying,
Don't catch a cold.
The robe still carried his warmth, enveloping me in a comforting heat. I suddenly said,
John, thank you.
I felt his body stiffen slightly. After a moment, he responded. I thought, even if he was pretending to be kind for revenge, I was willing to indulge in it. The next morning, I woke up to find John still lying beside me. As I tried to get up, he sensed it, pulled me back into bed, and held me in his arms, murmuring,
Don't leave me.
Those words hit me hard, filling me with both joy and sorrow. After a long time, John woke up and saw me with my eyes open.
Princess, why didn't you wake me?
I reached out to touch his gentle jaw, resting my head on his chest.
I couldn't bear to.
Sitting at the dressing table, John gently stroked my long black hair.
Let me help you with your hair, princess.
He picked up a jade comb and gently combed from the top of my head to the ends, his movements so gentle that I felt no pain.
John, am I beautiful?
He put down the comb and sincerely replied.
Princess, you are very beautiful.
I don't believe you. You must be flattering me.
He leaned in close, looking at me from a very short distance.
What are you doing?
He picked up the eyebrow pencil.
Princess, you can close your eyes.
I didn't close my eyes and stared straight at him. He smiled and began to draw my eyebrows.
From now on, don't call me princess.
Then what should I call you?
Call me Ava.
Lately, I've been feeling increasingly fatigued. The royal physician said it was due to my worries and prescribed some tonics. Charles suggested that instead of taking those tonics, he could make medicinal meals for me. I agreed, as Charles's medicinal meals tasted good and had no bitterness. So, Charles prepared different meals for me every day and didn't allow John to share, saying they were made exclusively for me.
You're being stingy, but fortunately, John never gets upset about it.
He has a good temper. I noticed that the princess's temper has also improved a lot recently.
Really? It seems I haven't lost my temper in a long time.
Since John lost his memory, I haven't lost my temper once. I continued eating the porridge without showing any emotion. As winter set in, the weather grew colder by the day. Today, large snowflakes were falling from the sky. Everything was covered in white as John and I strolled through the Qinglong temple. The snow was deep, making it difficult to walk. We held hands and walked slowly. I saw a gray bird lying in the snow, still flapping its wings. Without thinking, I prepared to step on it.
Why do you want to step on it?
Hurting it makes me feel happy.
John's expression turned serious, but he still spoke to me in the gentlest tone.
Ava, that's not right.
John gently shook his head, squatted down, and picked up the struggling bird, holding it in his hands.
Come, touch it.
He brought the injured bird closer to me. Hesitantly, I reached out and gently stroked its feathers. The soft down felt surprisingly pleasant to the touch. The bird trembled lightly under my hand, looking so fragile and vulnerable.
I want to show you that saving a life brings far more joy than taking one.
I thought to myself, I'm beyond saving. He reminded me too much of William. I would willingly die at his hands. That day, we brought the bird back, and John bandaged it, fed it, and gave it water. In the warmth of the house, with careful care, it gradually recovered. When it finally spread its wings and flew again, both John and I smiled. The bird joyfully flew around the room and eventually flew towards me. Instinctively, I reached out, and it indeed landed on my hand.
See? The joy of saving a life is incomparable.
But the stains of blood on my hands can never be washed away.
I thought about all the wrongs I had done and wondered if William would blame me. He said nothing, just kept stroking the bird's back repeatedly. One day, I lay on John's lap and said,
Tell me about the things you remember.
He had told me before that he only forgot the past 2 years but remembered everything before that.
It's all about battles and wars, nothing worth mentioning. Why don't you tell me about yourself?
I started speaking in a low voice.
Once, I had a lover. His name was...
After I finished, John remained silent, just stroking my hair over and over. After winter set in, my health deteriorated. The royal physician came to check on me daily but could not diagnose the problem. John gently comforted me.
Lily, don't worry. You'll get better.
Lying on the couch, I felt weak and powerless. Snow was falling outside, and I suddenly wanted to go out and see it.
I want to go out and see the snow.
I knew John would agree. Sure enough, he said.
All right, I'll carry you out.
I was wrapped in several layers of thick clothing and the warmest fur coat. Thus, I quietly stayed on his back, watching the vast whiteness. I couldn't withstand the cold for long. After a short while, I started coughing. John asked with concern.
Do you want to go back inside?
No.
The cold seemed to clear my head, making it less painful. I held onto his neck, resting my chin on his shoulder. Although I could have asked him to put me down, I didn't want to. The snow was falling heavily, covering the plum blossoms in my courtyard, and their fragrance was no longer detectable. I watched for a long time without getting bored, but I thought John might be getting tired, so I said,
Put me down. I'm not so weak that I can't stand.
He gently put me down, and as soon as I left his back, I felt even colder, wrapping the fur coat tightly around me. But it was no use. The cold seemed to penetrate my bones, impossible to resist. I looked at John, who was dressed much more lightly than I was, yet he didn't seem to fear the cold. His eyes were on me, but I felt his gaze was empty. Suddenly, I felt bored.
Let's go back inside.
John supported me as we slowly walked back. We were almost inseparable, yet I felt an emptiness inside. Charles came to see me again, bringing the ham and chicken soup he had made.
I don't have much of an appetite.
Charles frowned and said,
Princess, your body is weak. How can you not eat?
All right, you're right. Bring it over.
He smiled at me, opened the food box, and prepared to feed me. I waved my hand and said,
I still have the strength for this.
The food he made was always the best in color, aroma, and taste. I ate a piece of ham and asked,
Where did John go?
Charles blinked and said,
Why are you asking me, Princess? I don't get along with him. How would I know where he went?
I suddenly started coughing again, unable to stop. Charles hurried over to pat my back, and finally, I coughed up some blood. Charles looked shocked and exclaimed,
Princess! Should I call the royal physician?
No need.
I continued eating the ham and chicken soup, and Charles stared at me intently. He suddenly said,
Stop eating.
You prepared this for me with care. It would be a waste not to eat it.
Charles's hands looked very much like William's. So, no matter what he brought me, I would eat it without hesitation. I was still smiling when he suddenly turned and left. I finished eating slowly, put down the bowl, and called Nanny Grace in.
Clean it up.
Nanny Grace was also surprised, but didn't ask anything, respectfully saying,
Yes, Princess.
I need you to investigate something for me. I know you have your own connections.
Nanny Grace looked nervous and said,
Yes, Princess. Please tell me. If it's within my power, I will do my best for you.
I knew she was loyal. In this world, she was the only one I could rely on. John didn't return until evening. As soon as he came back, I asked,
Where did you go?
He said softly,
I'm sorry, Lily, for making you worry. I went to find a renowned doctor for you. The royal physicians are incompetent, but there must be someone out there who can cure you.
Such tasks should be left to the servants. Don't leave me for so long again.
He obediently nodded, and I leaned into his embrace, borrowing his warmth to temporarily warm myself. At night, he held me as we slept. Listening to his heartbeat, though he was close, I felt as if we were worlds apart. A few days later, it was a warm, sunny day. I felt much better today and had some strength. So I said to John,
Accompany me for a walk. I'll take you somewhere.
He had no objections and let me lead him. In winter, the ground was covered with dry branches and leaves, crunching underfoot. Holding hands, we walked slowly, with only the sound of crunching leaves breaking the silence. I pointed to an unmarked tombstone and said,
We're here.
I noticed his palm was sweaty, and his hand trembled slightly, so I let go of his hand. I calmly said,
Aren't you going to ask whose grave this is?
He turned his face away and didn't answer. I continued,
This is Lily's grave. You buried her with your own hands. Have you forgotten?
The day I ended her life, He carried her body far away, choosing this secluded and quiet place, even carefully leaving the tombstone unmarked. But there was nothing in this world I couldn't find out. He remained silent. I continued.
These days of sharing a bed but dreaming different dreams, you must have been in great pain. Every night lying beside me, you must have been thinking about how to end me to ease your hatred, right?
John finally turned to look at me, his eyes red and bloodshot. I understood his gaze. It was filled with the deepest pain and the most venomous hatred. He suddenly reached out and grabbed my neck. Already weak, I immediately felt dizzy and breathless. My vision darkened, but I didn't struggle, letting him choke me. Suddenly, he let go. I bent over, coughing violently, and coughed up more blood. I wiped the blood from my mouth with my sleeve and smiled.
Why don't you kill me?
He also laughed, his voice almost strange and broken.
Dying like this is too easy for you.
I sat down against a tree and said calmly.
Indeed. Besides, you don't want to bear the crime of harming a princess. You have no parents, but you have relatives. If not for this, why would you play along with me?
He looked at me coldly, his disdain evident.
You're right. If it weren't for your cruel and despicable methods, I wouldn't have pretended to have amnesia and played along with you.
I found it hard to breathe and couldn't speak anymore. He ignored me and walked to the tombstone, gently caressing it, calling out tenderly.
Lily, I'm here. Lily. Lily.
His voice was filled with infinite tenderness, genuine and heartfelt. I thought, even when he spoke to me with the sweetest words, there was never a trace of true emotion. He knelt before the tombstone.
I failed to protect you. My Lily.
I suddenly said hoarsely.
Do you remember who harmed William in the story I told you?
He didn't turn around or respond. I continued indifferently.
I harmed that minister's entire family long ago, but one of his daughters escaped.
John's back trembled. I whispered.
You guessed it, didn't you?
He turned his head, his eyes wide with disbelief. I laughed heartily, without any regard for decorum. Finally, I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was in the princess's residence, on my own bed. King Edward was sitting by the bed, frowning at me.
What's wrong with you?
I didn't want to see him, so I covered my face with my sleeve.
Are you going to act with me too? I've been acting enough lately. I don't want to act with you anymore.
He paused and said nonchalantly.
You're delirious from illness. What nonsense are you talking about?
At this point, there was no need to maintain a facade of peace. I asked bluntly.
That day, when John went to the palace to see you, what did you discuss? Did you decide what charges to pin on me? Or are you going to list all my past wrongdoings one by one?
He was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke hoarsely.
Of course, I haven't forgotten.
I looked at him calmly. His expression was dazed, as if he was no longer himself, just an empty shell.
So you do know you owe me.
My throne. I
found it amusing.
So you do know you owe me.
He closed his eyes in pain, seemingly unable to speak. I endured the discomfort in my body and continued.
My husband William helped you wholeheartedly, but he was harmed by the former prince, and I lost my unborn child because of it. If it weren't for our careful planning and full support, do you think you could have secured this position?
King Edward's face showed a hint of pain.
Stop talking.
I felt the pain too, but I had to lay it bare for him to hear.
No matter how many people I harm, it's never enough.
King Edward was silent, and I mustered all my strength to raise my voice.
I want the whole world to be buried with him.
Ignoring his panicked expression, I continued.
What, do you think I'm crazy?
Yes, I had gone mad long ago. From the moment my William died, I went mad. King Edward opened his eyes, and I saw unshed tears in them.
I'm sorry.
Don't say sorry. Sorry is useless.
King Edward sighed heavily.
I indulged you because I owe you a lot.
Then why do you want to harm me?
He lowered his head, his voice so soft I could barely hear it.
Because you've done too many wrong things.
I understand. You can leave now.
He probably felt awkward too, and staying here served no purpose. So he stood up and left. I got up, walked barefoot to the table, and picked up a candle. I set the curtains on fire. This fabric burned quickly, and the fire spread. Servants noticed the smoke coming from my room and ran around shouting.
Fire! Someone help!
I locked the doors and windows, not letting anyone in. Charles also came, anxiously shouting.
Princess, open the door. Please, open the door.
Charles, didn't you want me gone when you poisoned me?
Outside the door, he stammered.
Aye.
Charles began to forcefully kick the door, but the materials used in the princess's residence were the best, and the door was very sturdy. He couldn't break it down immediately. I coughed violently, feeling like I was coughing up my heart. Finally stopping, I used my last bit of strength to say,
Charles, I want to see John.
I wanted to see his face, his eyes one last time. After William died, my happiest moments were during the days John pretended to have amnesia and approached me. But my voice was too weak, and Charles couldn't hear it. Even if he did, John wouldn't come to see me. Never mind, it didn't matter if he didn't come. I always knew he hated me deeply. And Charles? Charles had been with me for many years, but every bowl of food he brought me was meant to take my life. He hated me too, I knew that. But it didn't matter how they saw me, I didn't care. I watched the flames burn fiercely before me, feeling a sense of relief. I was about to see William. Maybe I should have done this long ago. I stood up and walked resolutely towards the hottest part of the flames. Closing my eyes, I embraced the heat and pain. Burn, burn away my flesh, burn away my sins. William didn't like me being stained with others' blood. Burn my filthy body clean, and leave a pure soul to meet him. John had a childhood friend, a girl he had seen from afar when he was young. That fleeting glimpse stayed with him for years. The girl wore white clothes and had a radiant smile, as bright as the moon. Her name was Emma. Her family faced a calamity, and when John saw her again, she was covered in dirt. Despite her disheveled state, there was a resilience in her eyes. John found her and promised to take care of her from then on, saying he would be her family.
Shy, Brother John.
John's heart, as hard as ice, melted at that moment. He thought that if she had feelings for him too, he would marry her when she grew up. But fate had other plans. The current king had a sister, and according to John, she was a madwoman. She did things without regard for right or wrong, simply because she wanted to. When she took John back, he was utterly repulsed by her. She used Emma to threaten John into submission. As a general with a powerful army, John had considered fighting back. But the princess's backer was the king. His family had been loyal for generations, was he to rebel? Rebellion would lead to rivers of blood, and the people would be displaced and homeless. He couldn't do it. But he also couldn't stand by and watch Emma suffer. John racked his brain for a solution, but the princess sought the king's decree for marriage. He couldn't resist and had to feign compliance temporarily. Secretly, he planned to escape with Emma. After much planning, the opportunity finally came. John almost succeeded. He had taken Emma out of the city. But the princess caught up with him. John never understood why the princess, with whom he had no personal enmity, tormented him so. He thought that if they couldn't escape, they might as well die together.
Serious, Emma, my Lily. Lily would be willing to die with Brother John, wouldn't she? If we can't live together, we can at least be buried together.
Lily was indeed willing. She held his hand without hesitation. John felt utterly useless, unable to protect the woman he loved as a general. But the princess insisted on killing only Emma. John's heart was buried with Lily's body. He would never let the princess have peace. The princess wanted him by her side, not because she was attracted to him. John used his connections to find out the reason. It turned out that the princess's deceased husband, the former minister William, had a face similar to his, especially the eyes, which were almost identical. He pretended to have amnesia to get close to the princess. He knew that even if the princess knew he was faking it, she wouldn't expose him. And indeed, she didn't. John deliberately did things William used to do and said things William used to say. Sometimes, the princess's confused and obsessed expression made John pity her. He knew the pain of losing a loved one. But princess, your pain is no excuse for harming innocent people. Princess, how do you wish to meet your end? John thought he wouldn't let her die easily. To completely bring down the princess, he needed someone's help. John secretly met with the king. The king was a just ruler, not a tyrant. John knew why he indulged the princess so much. He owed her. His throne was given to him by the princess and William. So many lives had been lost, it was time to settle the debt. John presented the evidence of the princess's crimes he had collected. Each one was a capital offense. The king was reluctant. After all, she was his sister, born of the same mother. After much deliberation, the king said he would consider it. It was already a good result, John thought with a bitter smile. He thought the princess would be brought to justice, but she took him to Emma's grave. He had dug it himself, how could he not remember? The princess was already gravely ill, but John knew it wasn't an illness. It was a slow-acting poison given by Charles. The princess had more enemies than just John. She was too weak to speak loudly but still asked him bitterly.
Sad, why don't you end my suffering?
She was pitiful, but did that mean Lily deserved to die? The princess revealed that Emma was the daughter of the minister who killed William. At that moment, John finally understood why Emma's family was destroyed. So that was it. That was why she insisted on killing Emma. John didn't know why he couldn't bring himself to end her suffering. Why not end it? She was guilty of heinous crimes and innocent lives lost. John couldn't find an answer. In the end, he thought maybe it was because ending it like this was too easy. She should suffer more to atone for her sins. John never returned to the princess's residence. He never wanted to see that mad woman again. John went to guard the border. Not long after, news came that the princess had ended her own suffering. John took a sip of strong liquor and laughed heartily, tears streaming down his face. That pitiful madwoman probably never had many truly happy days in her life. John poured another cup of liquor and spilled it on the yellow earth, saying,
Sad, Lily, she's gone. You can rest in peace now.
Amidst the swirling sand and cold wind, John saw Lily in her pure white dress, smiling as she walked towards him. Charles was an orphan. Foster mother and found him in a bamboo grove and took him home, naming him Charles. Foster mother and worked at the princess's residence and earned a decent salary, so Charles not only had enough to eat and wear but also attended school. Charles loved studying poetry and literature, and foster mother and supported him, saying that if he became a top scholar, she would die content. But foster mother and didn't live to see that day.
When Charles was 13, after school, he waited for foster mother and to bring him something delicious, but she never came.
all he received was her cold, lifeless body. With red eyes, Charles knelt before her, vowing to avenge her one day. From then on, Charles began working and studying simultaneously, taking on 2 jobs a day and no longer attending school, instead teaching himself. He kept an ear out for news from the princess's residence. One day, he heard that the princess was selecting a consort. The princess, not yet 20, was notorious for her indulgence, and Charles despised her deeply. Moreover, she was ruthless, having ordered the execution of all the servants in the residence for unknown reasons. Charles loathed and hated the princess but had no choice but to find a way to get close to her. Princess Eleanor could do anything without facing any consequences. No minister ever dared to impeach her. Charles knew that only by relying on himself could he seek revenge. Charles had always been handsome, and as he grew older, he became even more striking. But he had no way to approach the high and mighty princess. So, Charles decided to wait for an opportunity. He bribed the servants of the princess's residence to find out her travel routes. Dressed in his finest clothes and with a unique hairstyle, he waited on the princess's path. Sure enough, the princess noticed him and, without asking his consent, ordered her servants.
Take him back.
After entering the residence, Charles lived a life of luxury, treated like a precious young master. But the princess seemed to forget about him, not summoning him for months. Charles grew anxious. Without getting close to the princess, how could he exact his revenge? One night, as Charles was preparing for bed, the princess suddenly barged into his room. Charles was stunned, seeing the princess drunk and disoriented, unsure of what to do. Her captivating eyes stared at him, filled with undisguised desire.
What should I do?
He had to admit, the princess's face was stunning, despite a scar on her left cheek. Even so, she was still beautiful, like a seductive peony.
Carry me to the bed.
She seemed boneless, clinging to Charles. Holding her soft, fragrant body, Charles, inexperienced, felt his heart race. Charles hid his hatred well, serving the princess diligently. Gaining the princess's trust was no easy task. It took Charles 6 years to achieve it. Initially, Charles thought of various ways to harm the princess, but none were feasible. The residence was heavily guarded, and everyone was searched upon entry. Weapons couldn't be brought in, and Charles had no martial skills. The princess had secret guards protecting her, making any attempt impossible. He also considered other methods, but all her food was tasted by servants first, making that plan unworkable. After 6 years, he finally gained the princess's complete trust. For the first time, she ate food he prepared without having it tasted first. At that moment, Charles felt a surge of joy. His long-awaited revenge was finally within reach. But harmful substances couldn't be brought into the residence. Charles devised a flawless plan. He used incompatible ingredients to prepare the princess's food. Over time, the accumulated toxins would weaken her, eventually leading to her demise. Charles never dared to entertain the idea of falling in love. He feared that if he developed genuine feelings, he wouldn't be able to go through with his plan. Charles constantly reminded himself that he had to avenge foster mother and, even at the cost of his own life. But in all fairness, the princess treated him well. She had a bad temper but never directed it at Charles. During his years in the residence, Charles became the princess's closest confidant. The princess often stared into space, and Charles found her empty, lonely gaze pitiful. She also frequently got drunk, always asking Charles to hold her when she did. Every time he held her, Charles felt a tormenting mix of emotions. He couldn't forget his hatred, nor could he completely suppress his feelings for her. The princess seemed to have everything, power, wealth, anything she desired. But Charles knew she was never truly happy. He had never seen her genuinely smile. Every time she smiled, her eyes were filled with endless sorrow. The first time Charles saw the princess smile was after General John entered the residence. Charles knew the princess truly loved him. Unfortunately, she didn't know how to love properly. Otherwise, she wouldn't have forced General John or harmed his lover. Charles even felt a twinge of jealousy towards General John. Why did he, who had accompanied the princess for 6 years, only gain her trust and reliance, while General John won her heart as soon as he arrived? Charles realized this thought was dangerous. He didn't need the princess's heart, just her trust. But watching the princess chase after the indifferent General John, Charles couldn't help but feel pained. After General John's lover was gone, Charles sought him out. He feared General John might do something reckless. Dealing with the princess was a task for one person. Don't let General John act, it would devastate her. But General John's resentment was no less than Charles's. He began pretending to have amnesia. Charles couldn't stop him and had to let him be. General John visited the king once, and though Charles didn't know what they conspired, he instinctively felt he had to act quickly. Otherwise, she would fall apart even more. Charles increased the dosage and delivered food to the princess more frequently. The princess grew weaker, bedridden. Watching her eat the prepared food, her eyes seemed to see right through him. Charles suddenly realized the princess couldn't be unaware. She had grown up in the palace, accustomed to deceit and betrayal. She had lost her will to live. She truly wanted to go. Charles was panicked, wanted to knock the bowl from her hands but could only tremble as she continued eating. Her eyes held a despairing calmness that Charles couldn't bear to see. He fled the room in a panic. Outside, Charles broke down in tears. Only then did he realize he had long since fallen hopelessly in love with her. It was wrong, but he couldn't help it.
Isn't it my end you wanted?
In the fire, the princess frantically questioned him. Charles felt his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces, unable to refute her. After the princess's passing, Charles was left in utter despair. He had lived driven by resentment, and now both his love and hate were extinguished. At foster mother Anne's grave, he said he had avenged her and asked her to rest in peace. In the wind and snow, a figure in blue walked away, not knowing where to go.
The end.